Hello, if you're new to this channel, my MO is taking a page from my sketchbook as inspiration for digital art. This time, I'm gonna draw this witchy student in Affinity Designer, primarily in the pixel persona, which is designer's painting interface, but I've only been using it for texturing my vector art. After all, I have Krita and Clip Studio for painting, but I want to challenge myself. Can the pixel persona match my drawing process in those other programs? Before I start, I'm gonna give this artboard a flat background color by selecting the artboard either on the layers panel or the artboard name on the workspace. Then I can set the fill color on the color panel. As you notice, it's not covering my sketch layers, it's just acting like a background. A soft rule is that I'll be using default brushes because Ohana means family and family means nobody gets left behind. I'll make new brushes later in the video, but you can already download them for free, link in the description. Stick around to find out how I'll use them. If you notice that the brush preview doesn't have thin to thick tapering, you could always toggle this force pressure setting on the context bar. Another useful setting to turn on is the stabilizer. It's a setting that corrects the jitteriness from drawing with your mouse or tablet, giving you smoother lines. The stabilizer has two modes, rope mode or window mode. I don't have enough experience with window mode to compare with rope mode. They have tooltips to describe how they work, so try experimenting. Both have this adjustable value to further modify how much they correct your lines. The higher the value, the slower it will feel to draw, keep that in mind. I made 3 layers of sketches. The roughest layer is meant to establish the gesture and flow of her pose. The second layer, the light blue, is to understand her anatomy and correct it if I have to. The third one in red is the detailed sketch where I combine the corrected anatomy with her clothes and braid, plus smaller details like buttons. If this was all traditional pencil, the paper would have already been a mess before I could introduce color. From the acrylics brush category, I picked the one called Gradual Acrylic Cotton Paper 1 because the core of the strokes looks solid, but it can also make soft edges. If I wanted hard edges, I would vector this. I only drew the outlines of the shapes, then filled them in by lassoing the interior and using the flood fill tool, the paint bucket tool of Affinity. Maxing out the tolerance to 100% means it won't read other pixels like my brush strokes. This method sounds like a few extra steps compared to simply vectoring, but that's my self-imposed challenge here. Stay in the pixel persona. I do find the imperfections in the shapes to be a feature of hand drawing, not a bug. The shapes don't turn out super smooth, and there might be sections where I pressed my pen lightly and the brush texture softens the outline. Those qualities add character to this character. I used shades of gray to fill each layer in, hadn't planned the actual values yet. Her arms won't be that dark and her face won't be that light either. I'm after contrast for now to easily identify the shapes. To help me decide the colors, I conjured a tiny wonky version of her. The watercolor painting already had the palette I needed, but I could still digitally adjust it to improve the saturation and introduce lighting effects later. It's her doppelganger, doing her best. Help me! This brush called Smooth Blending Acrylic has some bristles on one side depending on the directions of the stroke. Double-clicking on the preview opens the brush editing menu to tweak the settings. In the Dynamics tab, I added a bit of hue jitter to this brush. Under this drop-down menu, I can choose what will control this jitter, then adjust the graph to smoothen the transition. I chose direction as the controller, which tells the hue jitter to occur based on my stroke direction. Imagine not cleaning your paintbrush enough, so the leftover color is affecting the next color. Subtle effect, but I'm here for that randomness. I turned on Protect Alpha on the context bar. My drawing monitor isn't that wide, so this option is hidden under this arrow button. Protect Alpha lets you paint only within the layer's existing pixels, not allowing you to draw on empty space. Don't forget to uncheck this setting when you don't need it. I know I shouldn't forget, because sometimes I would use the brush but nothing comes out. I'd be confused for a moment until I remember to turn it off. While I was at it, I did some basic shading on the skirt because it's the largest part of the character and I wanted to map out the pleating already. With the advantage of zooming in and finer brush sizes, I was able to add some more gold details to her uniform. Her buttons are now gold and there are linings on her skirt and ribbon. Maybe not on her blouse, they didn't rhyme well so I darkened it back. The layers for the gold details are nested under a parent layer, which is how clipping masks work in Designer. When I needed to adjust a layer's hue and saturation, I created an adjustment layer through this button on the Layers panel. The HSL option means hue, saturation, and lighting. Since I use this a lot, I set the shortcut to Control U. That's the typical shortcut in other painting programs. As an adjustment layer, it's listed on the Layers panel so you can double-click on it to readjust the values. Another advantage is that it can be duplicated so I can apply the skin tone adjustment to the other arm. Just nest this layer under the pixel layer. Guiding me through the shading and lighting phase is an HSL layer with saturation set to 0%. This desaturates all the colors, letting me see the values and contrast better. Her top half should be lighter than her bottom half, so parts like her legs can't be as bright as her blouse. That's another HSL layer to adjust those stockings. When I want to commit to these adjustments, I right-click on the pixel layer and rasterize. It's a function I use often, so I bound it to the F9 key. Rasterizing is like merging selected layers and their sublayers into one pixel layer. If I was rasterizing a vector layer, that's how I convert it into a pixel layer. Back to Thumbelina over here. Existence is pain! I tested out the lighting and shading effects. I decided on one color for global highlights and another for the global shading, then set some blending modes like color dodge, multiply, overlay. Her light source will be the spell she's casting. While I hadn't figured out how that would look like, I could at least plan the colors, giving it more dimension than the traditional painting, with pink as the base color, purple for shading, and some pastel for the highlights. Still had no idea how to render the magic spell, but a cloudy, smoky streak was a start. That's about the volume I sketched. I played around with smudging and mixed in some other brushes to give this texture. Those brushes were from the watercolor and spray categories. The spell should be allowed to look experimental, to not be as solid and clean as the witch. The effect is mainly inspired by nebulas, but at the moment it looks like fire and smoke. I'll figure that out later. It's capped off with an airbrush layer set to color dodge as a glow effect. That should do for a working light source. I could move on to shading. My shadow layers are made of this adjustment layer called Recolor Adjustment. On normal blend mode, this adjustment renders the layers underneath it into a monochromatic hue. I shifted it to purple as intended and set it to the blend mode multiply to sharpen the contrast. Adjustment layers come with a mask where I can erase some sections or brush them back in. On an alpha mask, a brush with darker tones erase while lighter tones add opacity. I airbrush the shadows away to establish the general direction of the lighting. Then with a sharper brush, I introduce sharper edges. This felt like I'm sculpting her contours from soft clay. Don't be shy with your shading. Since I was jumping between brush categories, I sorted my favorites into a new category. It can be created from this burger menu, then renamed into favorites. Right-click on a brush from another category to copy it into the new one. I continued shading the other layers and groups by pasting the first recolor layer into them. When pasting adjustment layers into groups, the group's blend mode should be set to normal, not pass-through. I'm pointing this out because both of those blend modes act similar at first. The difference can be seen when you have adjustment layers and layers with other blend modes. If the group is on a normal blend mode, it limits those effects into only influencing the layers inside, while pass-through lets those effects influence layers outside. The highlights are also recolor adjustments, but brighter and set to color dodge. The brushwork covers the peaks of her contours and light blooms from her spell. Areas closer to the spell are bathed in lighting, while areas farther still show the base colors. Sometimes one highlight layer isn't enough, so I would add extra highlight layers and rim lights. The new layers could be set to normal mode or become another color dodge layer, as long as the lighting is pinkish. I found that it is indeed possible to paint in the pixel persona the same way as I do in my go-to programs. It's not as feature-rich as Clip Studio, but my process can adapt as long as there are clipping masks, adjustment layers, blend modes, and a familiar brush engine. But because I have better alternatives, I don't find myself defaulting to the pixel persona for painting. But I wouldn't mind doing this challenge again. This far in, I'm still amazed at how this illustration was turning out on what I previously assumed was a bare-bones workspace. The witch herself is done, but there's no rest for the wicked. Her spell needs some more noodling. Erased some holes into the smoke to get this stringy wispy shapes of a nebula. Nebulas also have stars, but I'm not going to draw the stars individually. A scatter brush would automate the randomness for me. A quick way to make a raster brush is to select the shape you want for the brush tip. On the burger menu, choose New Brush from Selection. Double-click the preview for the brush editing options. Raise the value of spacing, then under the Dynamics tab, the values for Size Jitter, Scatter X, and Scatter Y will complete a basic spray effect. Now sprinkle that good stuff. Since this brush was created from a selection, this brush won't let you recolor it. It's strictly sticking to the original color, which was white. There are raster brushes that can change color, but I'll have to import them from PNGs. On a separate file, I laid out black shapes on artboards with white backgrounds. In addition to that narrow diamond star, I drew a chunky petal star and this half moon or halo shape. I cropped the artboards to compress the spacing. Make sure their backgrounds are white before exporting into PNGs. On the brush panel's burger menu, I made new intensity brushes from the PNGs one at a time. As you can see, I have light blue on my color wheel, which these brushes are using. The chunky star and the halo had some randomized rotation jitter to them. I lightly masked away some stars so they look like they're fading as they travel away from the source. The stars also need some glow, so I clicked the Layers Effects button to access outer glow. High radius with low intensity produces soft glows. I brought back the volume on the nebula with a blotchy brush from the ink category. It gives the visual effect another dimension, as if she's summoning this nebula from the void. So, for reference, from bottom to top, the layers for this spell are dark purple cloud, tiny background stars, purple wisp, thinner fruity wisp, the minty light core, the red color dodge glow, foreground stars, and the halos. These stars are the brushes I mentioned I'll share as a free download called Magical Girl Stars. The link is in the description. I tweaked the stars a bit more and made a stamped version of each shape. So that's a total of 6 brushes to add some free kira to your personal and commercial projects. I don't have Affinity Photo, so I can't confirm if these brushes work there, but if you do, let me know if they do work. And if you like them, Please consider paying what you want for these brushes to show your support. Alright, I have a few spells for finishing touches. A simple and abstract background so as to not take away from the rendering on her character. A solid contact shadow down there would imply that she's standing on a floor, not floating away in empty space. Next, I duplicated the whole artboard, then rasterized it down to a flat copy. Among the layer effects, there's Gaussian blur. I gave this layer a mask where I raised the blur from areas intended to be the focus. Those are on the upper body and the core of her spell. I softened the blur on secondary areas like the rest of her side facing the spell. So that's a fake depth of field effect. Last finishing touch, I sprayed some noise all over everything. First black noise, then white, then for some saturation, red. All that spray in one layer is set to overlay and opacity cranked down to below 10%. It's a subtle noise effect for a digital vintage look as if it's from a screenshot or image scan. And roll the before and after. Compared to the watercolor sketch, this witch looks like she's further along her studies. She's learned to harness cosmic energy for her midterm exam. Thanks for watching everyone. Hope you enjoyed this video enough to give it a like and let me know your thoughts or questions in the comments. Subscribe to my channel for more art videos and check out my Ko-fi for the brush download. Bye bye!